Let's jump right into this explainer. We're looking at a fascinating planning board meeting from May 12, 2026. We're going to unpack exactly why the Maple Ridge Subdivision project hit a major roadblock. This single meeting, it perfectly captures the real friction happening in towns everywhere right now.
So, here is our roadmap. We'll start with the Maple Ridge proposal itself, then look at abutters and public concerns. After that, we'll dive into the big debate over Section 10.2a, look at the missing docs and technical flaws, and wrap up with what happens next.
All right, let's kick things off with Section 1, the Maple Ridge proposal.
What exactly is the developer trying to do here? Well, looking at official town planning documents, this is a major subdivision review. The plan is to take a largely undeveloped, forested area right in the town's farm and forest district and totally transform it. The developer wants to build 14 single-family lots, which would use up about 27 acres. Now, the breakdown of the land is where it gets really interesting. They plan to leave nearly half the site, about 45.5 acres, as preserved open space. But catch this, 16.4 acres of prime upland area is actually being retained by the owner, kept completely separate from the development. Keep that little detail in your back pocket, because oh boy, it becomes a huge sticking point later. Also, these homes would rely on private wells and residential sprinkler systems instead of a shared water cistern.
That brings us to Section 2, abutter and public concerns.
Look, anytime someone proposes changing 122 acres of forest, the neighbors are absolutely going to show up, right? During the public hearing, residents of the abutting property raised some major red flags. And as you can see from this quote, their number one worry was water. These residents really urged the board to enforce strict 100-foot vegetative buffers. Why? To protect the unnamed tributaries flowing off the property straight into the Chandler Brook Preserve. Because let's face it, water doesn't just stop at property lines. Altering drainage upstream can have a massive domino effect downstream.
The public also brought up recent state laws about ADUs, or accessory dwelling units. In case you're not familiar, an ADU is essentially a secondary, independent living space right on the same lot as a primary home. Like an in-law suite or a backyard cottage.
So state laws now require towns to allow ADUs on single-family lots, and residents of the abutting property asked a super logical question. Is this really just 14 homes? Will these 14 lots quietly multiply over time? I mean, think about it. If even half of these new homeowners decide to build an ADU over the next 10 years, suddenly 14 homes becomes 21 or more. That's more septic systems, more cars, and way more strain on the local environment. They wanted to know if the developer would set up strict homeowner association deed restrictions to prevent this. But at the meeting, the developer couldn't give them a definitive answer.
And then there was the elephant in the room, or rather, the auto salvage yard right across the street. A local resident absolutely hit the nail on the head with this quote. People are terrified about potential groundwater contamination. Specifically, they're worried about PFAS chemicals and heavy metals from the auto salvage yard seeping into the private wells of these proposed homes. Because nobody wants to buy their dream home only to discover they need to shell out for a wildly expensive filtration system just to drink a glass of tap water.
Okay, let's move on to Section 3, the Section 10.2a debate.
When we transition from public comments to the board's actual deliberation, this is where things really heated up. The friction of the entire night centered squarely on the town's land use ordinance, specifically Section 10.2a. Now, this rule essentially says developers must avoid wetlands whenever humanly possible. They have to cluster their houses on the driest, most suitable land they have, preserving sensitive environments to the maximum extent practical.
And this right here, this is the core conflict. The board is looking at the map and they see the developer is proposing to put these 14 lots smack in and around several wetlands. They even want to fill a section of wetland just for a road crossing. But remember those 16.4 acres of prime, dry upland the owner was holding on to? The board basically said, wait a second, why aren't you putting the houses up there, on the dry land, like Section 10.2a requires? The developer fired back, arguing that shifting the lots up north would mean building an extra 1,000 feet of road. More road equals more stormwater runoff, which isn't great for the environment, and, to be frank, it would just make the project too expensive to build. It wouldn't be financially viable. But the board was not having it. They held their ground, insisting with the town ordinance prioritizes wetland protection way above a developer's business model. One board member literally said it's not their job to make sure the developer's business plan works, it's their job to enforce the rules.
Next up, Section 4, missing docs and technical flaws.
So, on top of this big philosophical debate over wetlands versus costs, the project ran face first into a wall of procedural red tape. The board went through a checklist of missing items. First off, no draft HOA covenants. Without those, you literally can't know how things like ADUs or stormwater maintenance are legally going to work. Second, the town engineer called out a really vague road profile for that wetland crossing, something about a confusing half-buried culvert. Third, their application for an Army Corps of Engineers permit was still pending, so the board had no idea if state and federal agencies even agreed with the developer's environmental plan.
Oh, and it gets worse. Board members pointed out a massive oversight in the environmental assessment provided by the developer's own consultant. The report meticulously listed the plants down in the wetland herb layer, sure, but it completely skipped the tree canopy data. And that data is explicitly required by the town's ordinance to figure out how to classify and protect the area. So understandably, the board deemed the report totally inconclusive.
And what about the public's fears regarding water contamination from the salvage yard? Well, the developer did bring in a water quality test from an existing well to show the water was fine. But the town engineer formally pushed back. He noted that relying on one single test well, located a full 400 feet away, just isn't a conclusive way to prove the downgrade subdivision site is safe from heavy metals or PFAS. They simply needed more proof.
Finally, Section 5. What happens next?
So where does this leave the Maple Ridge subdivision after such an intense, scrutinized meeting? Well, at the end of the May 12th session, the board officially withheld preliminary approval. They put the developer on strict notice. If they want this project to ever break ground, they absolutely must justify their lot placement under the Section 10.2a wetland rules. They have to explain why they're building near the water instead of the dry land. Plus, they've got to hand over all that missing technical data, from the HOA covenants right down to a proper tree canopy assessment.
Basically, the developer walked away with a massive homework assignment, and the town proved they aren't backing down on their environmental ordinances. Which brings us to a really critical thought to ponder as we wrap up this explainer. As our towns keep growing and the demand for housing goes through the roof, how do we actually strike that perfect balance? How do we push for new residential development while maintaining an absolute, uncompromising commitment to protecting our natural environment? It is a puzzle that every planning board is trying to solve right now. Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive.